Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, a seasoned political pollster and Senior Vice President of Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Megan. Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. It's good to be with you. I'll be taking you through some of our latest data about the shape of the country, and then Cliff will be providing a summation, some high-level thoughts. And then, as usual, we will endeavor to answer all of your questions at the end. If you do have any questions throughout, please, I encourage you to use the Q&A function of the GoToWebinar app on your screen to submit the questions at any time, and then we will come to them at the end. So today we're going to go through a couple of topics. First and foremost, we're going to talk about the latest data on the pandemic, still the #1 issue facing the country. Then we'll turn to and talk a little bit about the Biden administration, particularly about the Biden administration's handling of the pandemic, which has really become very much sort of the make or break issue. Then turn to some of our latest data about reopening the country. We are sort of getting to a point where it feels like the pandemic may be coming to an end. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and talk a little bit about what we see there. But we want to end on sort of a note of caution that a lot of the trends that led us to the place where the pandemic was able to get out of control in the United States still exist in this country. And that is probably going to be a little bit of a bumpy road still coming out of this period. So first, the pandemic, and just to sort of level set with where the pandemic is right now, it's getting better. We're certainly seeing the pandemic sort of getting a little bit slower, nothing like the surge we saw over the holidays. But we still see over 500,000 people, Americans, have died, and still seeing over 60,000 confirmed new cases a day, which we would have last summer thought as a really high level. It's just only after the heights we saw over the holidays that feels a little bit low. So the pandemic is still very much real, still very much with us. And when we look at the impact of the pandemic, we can see that it is being increasingly felt across the country, even as it does seem to be something that we're starting to be able to think about as behind us. Over a third of Americans know someone who has died. Over 4 in 5 Americans know someone who's tested positive. And then if you project out the actual positive test rates the CDC has been publishing, we can see about 1 in 10 Americans have tested positive themselves at this point. So, you know, we assume that there's probably more people who actually have had COVID than formally tested positive, but still there's a lot of people who could potentially still be at risk who have not yet gotten the disease. But we're seeing at the same time that Americans are getting restless, that our data from our Axios Ipsos consumer tracker is showing that Americans are increasingly getting out of the home and doing stuff as the weather sort of improves, and also as sort of the pandemic seems to be getting a little bit better. There was a downtick in the number of people going to visit friends and family or going out to eat over the holidays when the worst of it was happening. But we've seen that over the last couple of weeks sort of ticking up, certainly not back to sort of pre-pandemic levels, but moving in that direction. But when we ask people directly if they're ready to reopen, we see most Americans are saying no, or that it's maybe happening too fast. This is from an ABC News poll that we did about a week and a half ago. And when we ask people if the following are happening too quickly, too slowly, or at the right pace, loosening mask mandates and loosening restrictions on gatherings, the majority of Americans said both were happening too quickly. This happened right after Texas and Mississippi announced that they were doing away with their mask mandates. And it shows that the majority of the public, not an overwhelming majority, but a majority, are in more of a place of sort of going slow and going safe rather than sort of pushing fast. Now, when we turn the question slightly to talk about schools and businesses, much more mixed response, right? And I think this reflects the tension that we're facing of people wanting to be safe, but not really wanting to see businesses and schools and students paying that price. Now, the main tool that we are using, the country is using to get out of the pandemic is the vaccine, of course, and the vaccine effort has We've seen increasing success. Actually, we pulled this just from Friday. Over the weekend on Saturday, there were 4.5 million cases administered of the vaccine, which is a new record for a single day. And we're seeing an average of over 2.5 million cases a day. And this is actually a really positive sign when taken with President Biden's statement last week about all Americans being eligible for the vaccine by May 1st, suggests that the trajectory of getting the vaccine to people is increasing, and that time of being able to sort of get back into the world is maybe moving up. And we'll turn to that a little bit more in a few moments. But we are seeing sort of a continued high amount of demand in our data. This is again from our Axios tracker, where almost 3/4 of Americans say that they plan to get the vaccine within the first few months of it being available to them, and that only about 1/4 of Americans are somewhat resistant, and only 21% are, or 20% really, if you sort of take the average, are what we're sort of referring to as that hard pass group that are very much resistant to getting the vaccine, that aren't very interested in it. And that number, that 20% that is sort of that hard pass, has actually been pretty consistent since December, reflecting some changing underlying trends we'll get into in a moment. And that trend is really that the opposition to the vaccine was early on based on sort of fears of the health effects, fears of the safety of the vaccines. We can see back in August when we first started asking about it, you saw half of Black Americans said that they were not likely to get the vaccine, 1/3 of Republicans, and then over 1/4 of Americans, 1/4 of Democrats, and this is the not at all likely, this is the hard pass number, right? And over the last couple of months, what we've seen is most of these groups have come down in their resistance to getting the vaccine. The one group that hasn't really changed is Republicans, who stayed at about 30%, saying that they're not at all likely to get the vaccine. So we're seeing that the group of people that are most resistant to getting the vaccine is increasingly driven by partisanship rather than purely by health or safety concerns, which has a slightly different calculus as we go into the summer than just a pure sort of health concern play. And as we sort of move from trying to get people who were concerned about the health to trying to get people who are concerned about partisanship to take the vaccine, it really requires sort of a change in thinking of how you communicate with these folks. This is trust in various organizations or entities or people to provide accurate information about the coronavirus, bipartisanship. And I think it's really telling that if you look at Democrats versus Republicans, you see some huge splits in the amount of trust they have for these various organizations. And I think you can sort of divide this chart into sort of two sides. On the left side, there are organizations where you see a majority or plurality of people from both Republican and Democratic Party trusting, and that would include the CDC, friends and family, local news, or state government. These are organizations that can sort of reach out, particularly to Republicans who are hostile to the vaccine at the moment, and have at least some measure of success. And then on the right, there's the organizations that are seen as sort of much less trustworthy, that really, I think, reflect some of the partisanship that we see in the country, that are going to have a harder time convincing these vaccine-resistant people. And that includes President Biden, includes national network news, includes national cable news, includes sort of anything from the federal government writ large. And then just for an example, I also included Donald Trump at the end. That's actually a little bit of an older number. That's from late January when we actually last asked about trust in Trump. But you can see even there, only a little under 2/3 of Republicans trusted what Trump said about it, which I think reflects, again, the difficulty of reaching this group of people who are now the sort of the core of people who are resistant to the vaccine. And that potentially are going to be the thing that we need to get past to get to something approaching a herd immunity level with the vaccine in the country. So, speaking of politics, let's talk a little bit about the Biden administration. So first off, main issues, right? Main priorities. This is an updated version of our main issues question, and there really are sort of two top tier issues and then a couple of sort of second tier issues that are sort of emerging. Number one is the economy and the pandemic. Is exemplified by economy, unemployment, and jobs, and public health, disease, and illness in the red and green bars, respectively. And it's actually sort of interesting as the public health number has come down a little bit in the last couple of weeks. Again, I think as an indication of the coronavirus pandemic, people feeling that it's maybe a little less urgent and being a little bit more interested in the economy. And then sort of in that second tier, immigration and then the healthcare system are sort of happening. And what we're seeing here in terms of the main issue is a return back to a pre-pandemic sort of attitude about main problems where Democrats and Republicans don't really see the same set of issues as priorities, and they're not even really talking about the same things at many times. So you can see here that Democrats, as sort of befits the Democratic Party, are talking about a bunch of different things, the economy, healthcare, public health, also inequality and discrimination, or the environment and climate are also sort of higher priorities, versus Republicans who are much more focused on the economy and now on immigration, which has surged in importance among Republicans in the last couple of weeks, which again, we'll sort of speak to in a little bit. And then independents, which, frequently sort of split the difference a little bit, are mostly focused on the economy and the pandemic, which is, again, sort of why we're sort of saying those are the top two issues. They're the ones that are a little bit less driven by partisanship and instead are just sort of, this is what we care about. So when we look at the public's review of Biden's job performance, we see that he's still getting pretty solid job approval. He took office January 20th, 55% of the country approved of his job performance. That sort of climbed up to about 58%. We saw a drop to 54% last week. We'll see this week when we get our next core political if that's a sustained drop or just a little bit of variance in the numbers, but he's maintained a pretty solid 50+ job approval rating really over the last couple of months. And when you actually break that down to the different aspects of his job, you can really see that as primarily because of his handling of the pandemic. 61% of the country approve of the job he's doing on the pandemic. That's about twice as many that approved of the job Trump was doing with the pandemic before he left office. And that really is sort of the core of Biden's message and sort of promise or offer to the country, is dealing with that. He's also getting pretty positive numbers on unifying the country, also sort of the perennial Democratic issues of the environment, and is still sort of net positive on employment and jobs, though that certainly isn't much higher than his overall approval rating. It's actually a little below his overall approval rating, so it's not necessarily driving his positive views. And then on other issues, you see approval of him sort of falls off, and there's a lot more people sort of saying that they don't know. Again, he's only been in office 2 months, so some of that makes sense. But again, if you look at this by partisanship, and what I have over on the right here is the net score. That's all the people who say they approve minus all the people who say they disapprove. There are some interesting patterns that come out. And the one I really want to point to is among Republicans, there's a really net negative sentiment towards Biden on some of those issues that I pointed out were the main issues earlier: immigration, the economy, taxation and corruption, which are sort of aspects of those as well. And you can really start to see, I think, the reflection of some of the sort of the culture war that's being sort of is continuing to be waged in the country, where Democrats and Republicans aren't even looking at the same topics or concerned about the same issues, nor are they reflecting on them the same. I mean, there's always going to be Democrats are going to like Biden, Republicans are going to dislike Biden just due to the nature of partisanship. But the places where that like or dislike is sort of most apparent, I think, is really telling about where the priorities are. So last week, the American Rescue Plan was passed by the Senate and the House. That's the big $1.9 trillion stimulus plan. And our data suggests that that is very popular with the American public, including with the majority of Republicans, 52%, which I think sort of speaks to, again, why Biden's overall approval rating has remained high. His first major act of policy is something that is very popular with the country overall. And then when we sort of ask people about sort of why, we can see that the majority of Americans do believe that this package, the stimulus plan, is going to help the country get back to normal faster. And as we sort of discussed earlier, that is really sort of the main focus of Americans right now, is getting back to normal. And almost by about a 2-to-1 ratio, Americans agree that this stimulus plan will help do that. Also, sort of Biden's sort of messaging about putting the country on war footing, brokering these deals between pharmaceutical companies to accelerate the production of vaccines. Again, by almost a 2-to-1 ratio, Americans are supporting these moves, which I think is both sort of speaking to people liking how Biden is handling the pandemic for the moment. So reopening the country, this is sort of where really everybody is sort of turning now. We're seeing we're doing a lot of new data, a lot of new surveys, really trying to measure it. And Cliff actually had a comment last week with one of our media partners where it's just sort of a jumble right now. People don't really know what to expect. They're not really sure how to navigate that. And we're seeing that in our data. But one of the other things we're seeing is that Americans are increasingly expecting to get back to normal sooner rather than later. Now, we've been asking about when do they expect to return to a normal life. It's always been sort of distant in the future. The plurality's been 6 months to a year from now. And that sort of marker has been sort of moving forward as when we've done the survey has sort of moved forward. But over the last couple of weeks, we've seen that instead of sort of always just being projected forward, it's increasingly people are sort of saying, no, I expect to be able to get back to normal sometime by the end of summer or early fall, August, September, something like that, if you actually sort of do the math out. And you can see here within the next 6 months went from about a quarter of Americans at the 1st of February to about 40% of Americans in the first full week of March. And that number continues to climb, I think, as people continue to sort of want to get back to normal. We'll have another number of this in the next week, and we'll have to see if Biden sort of promises about people being able to spend the 4th of July with their family even hastens this further. But there is this increasing sense that, the end is in sight and that people are starting to feel like maybe we're going to get there this year. And as with that, we're seeing a change in how Americans are feeling. This is from a series of questions we did with Axios, where we asked them, what were the primary emotions you felt in the last year, and what is the primary emotions you're feeling today? And when we asked them about the last year, the dominant feelings were stress, worry, frustration, being overwhelmed or burnt out. Again, not terribly surprising, but these sort of very sort of negative emotions created by the pandemic. When I ask them how they're feeling today, the dominant emotion is overwhelmingly hopeful. 50% almost, half of Americans, 48%, are saying that they're feeling hopeful today. That's a significant increase versus where they were feeling over the last year. And the number of people saying they're stressed or frustrated or worried or burnt out has dropped. In the case of stressed or frustrated, has dropped in half. And again, I think this sort of reflects this sort of feeling that we're coming out of it, that we're having, and these sort of more positive sentiments that people are able to start having now. With that, we're seeing consumer confidence climbing. Consumer confidence dropped precipitously after the pandemic started, after the lockdown started. Not quite as low as it did back in the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, but pretty dramatic, especially over the course of such a time period. And then it was sort of up and down, slowly going up over the summer and fall of last year. But then when the pandemic surged in the fall, it really sort of paused. But since the Biden inauguration, really since the vaccines started going into sort of mass distribution, we've seen a very sort of steady increase in consumer confidence, to the point where now it's at 56.7, which doesn't really mean anything in this, but over the entire 20-year time span of this particular tracker, that's actually above average over the entire time span. And on a number of different measures, we're seeing consumer confidence in a in actually a relatively good place. So for instance, one of them is household purchase comfort. That's like being able to afford your stuff for your house. And the number of Americans that are comfortable with their ability to afford things for their household has gotten over 50% this last week. And that's noteworthy because after the Great Recession, it took 5 years for that number to get above 50%. Whereas here we are a year after sort of the drop from the pandemic, and we're already back to that threshold, which again, I think speaks to sort of people's increasing positivity. When we ask people what they're expecting to do, really, as we're coming out of the pandemic, really the things people are sort of talking about doing first are the ones that allow them to engage with others. So it's going shopping, it's going out to restaurants and bars, and it's all the sort of the little things that allow people to have those social interactions that I think many people have been starved of in this last year. And then some of these other things are seen as a little bit further down the road. This is from our Ipsos consumer tracker, and this is just among people who say they use these services. But you can see things like travel, things like going to the gym, things like going to stadiums or theaters or whatever. People are not expecting to do that in the near future. What they really are more talking about doing soon are those things like going out to eat, going out to get a drink, going out to see friends. And I think that, again, speaks to sort of where Americans' priorities are. And I think you can sort of, extrapolate that to a lot of other topics that we didn't survey on, that people are really going to be doing stuff that allow them to have those social contacts first, and then maybe sort of those bigger ticket or more involved things later. But when it comes to the pandemic, like I referred to earlier, Americans aren't necessarily pushing or rushing to get out the door. There is very much sort of a wait and see approach where we do see that majorities of Americans are really, or pluralities of Americans are really sort of taking a more cautious view to the pandemic. For instance, the majority of Americans disagree with the statement that Americans should return to pre-COVID activity levels. Pluralities say they're going to wait to see what others do before deciding what they're going to do, or that or disagree that they're going to return to pre-COVID levels once they're vaccinated, no matter what. Again, I think this reflects sort of Americans' sort of continued desire not to get sick, continued desire to sort of play it safe. But there is, I think, definitely sort of an increasing number of people who are sort of pushing in that other direction. These numbers aren't flat by any way, shape, or form, but there is still sort of the majority that are sort of wanting to be safe rather than be fast. And then one final thing in this area is that even when we do get out of the pandemic, normal is not going to really be what we are accustomed to as normal. About a third of Americans continue to work primarily from the home. And in some survey research we did about 2 weeks ago, when we asked those people what they want when they go back to work, we see they don't really want to go back to a workplace where they're in the office every day for the full day. Only about 40% want that sort of return to the office the full time. Instead, the large majority, almost 3/4, want flexibility and feel that they'll be more productive with a flexible schedule, or want to return to the office sort of occasionally or on some sort of flexi schedule kind of thing. And there are some really interesting patterns with this where we see parents and women are much more interested in sort of more flexibility. People who are more highly educated and more affluent definitely want more flexibility, and sort of men and younger people and urbanites are actually the ones who are more interested in getting back into the office more regularly. So there are definitely some interesting patterns which suggests that there's not really going to be a good one-size-fits-all solution for the workforce coming out of the pandemic, but instead we're going to need to learn sort of how to be a little bit more adaptive. All right, so then to finish up before we go into questions and answers, and again, please, if you have any questions, submit them on the app. If you've ever joined us for our previous talks, we like to talk a little bit about the age of uncertainty, which is sort of our view of society writ large over the past couple of decades. And that the basic thesis behind that, just sort of a refresher, is that American society is undergoing some really significant changes in how it's structured. Those changes are helping drive and supercharge a couple of other trends, which are leading to a continued sort of partisanship and policy confusion, sort of inability to sort of tackle big tasks. And those trends have not been changed by the pandemic. If anything, they sort of continue to exist, if not are a little bit more supercharged, which suggests that even though Biden was able to get this large stimulus bill pushed through, we should not expect the path out of the pandemic to be a smooth one. So first off, changing American society. We usually talk about the change in the race or ethnic makeup of society, where it had gone from a 80% white to a 49% white in about 15 years country, or the change in educational attainment went from primarily high school educated to primarily some sort of collegiate educated in about 15 or 20 years. But I want to show you instead this new study we did recently about sexual attraction by generation, where we can really see, again, one of those facets of society changing. So you can see among baby boomers, 84% say they are only attracted to people of the opposite sex. And then Gen Z, which are, for our survey, 18 to 24-year-olds, only half, 52%, say they are only attracted to the opposite sex. Instead, there's much more people who are have a much more sort of pansexual sort of attraction. And this is one of those case points of a changing American society, right? If you're a baby boomer, sort of older person, like these younger folks who have this much more sort of pansexual orientation, it's a very sort of alien view of the world, and that sort of helps describe this sort of changing structure of society that's driving some of the reaction that we've seen in the last couple of years. Likewise, trust, there's been a long-term decline in trust in American society, and we see that has played out over the last year, where the pandemic has driven a decline in trust. This is trust in the federal government, started off actually pretty high at the start of the pandemic, particularly among Republicans. Again, this was as Trump was president, so no surprise. But over the course of the pandemic, it declined throughout the sort of the time period, and then when the election happened, there was an inversion where Republicans lost faith in the federal government because Trump was no longer running it. Democrats gained faith because Democrats took control of it. And there's been an increase, but the reality is these long-term declines have been pretty sticky. And I think it is a big open question of, is the Biden administration going to be able to reestablish some of this confidence in government? Because if not, that sort of really supercharges some of the partisanship in society as people feel the government is not able to deliver for them. And then finally, another thing I want to show you is trusted professions in the country. There are certainly some groups that remain pretty highly trusted: healthcare workers, doctors, teachers, people in the armed forces, scientists, even, majority levels of trust. But there's some groups that are getting really, really, really not highly trusted. Politicians, you can see on the right, 15% trust, 61% untrustworthy. I think that's and I even sort of left it there so that the bar would hang real low, just to really make that clear, just sort of how low that is. And I think, again, remember, politicians are the ones who are sort of doing a lot of this work that we need to get the country to work. And the reality is Americans don't trust them. And even the 69% trusting healthcare workers isn't actually that overwhelming, right? That's only 2/3 of Americans. There are a considerable number of people who don't have a significant level of trust of anyone, and I think that speaks to some of the challenges we're facing in American society. So as we sort of look forward, a bare majority of Americans think that beating the pandemic will help people have more confidence in the government, but to sort of speak to this age of uncertainty, fewer than half of Americans think that the country is actually going to emerge from the pandemic stronger and more united than ever, which was a line Biden used in his speech last week. And I think this sort of speaks to some of the challenges we face as a country, is that the division, the partisanship, the reality that's a changing country and a lot of people don't necessarily like the way it's changing, are reflected. And that's going to be very much part of the society over the next couple of months and over the next couple of years. our data sources. Thank you. Cliff, if you want to come on and provide your sort of summation, and then anyone who would like to submit a question, please go ahead and do so.
Yeah, thanks you so much, Chris, and thanks everyone for being here. I won't take much time. I think it was a great presentation. There's three big broad points I just want to make. The first one is what will be the residual effect of the pandemic on our behaviors? I don't think we know. I think that's a huge question mark at this point. We just take, for instance, this whole notion of fuzziness in people's heads. There was a clear start when the lockdowns happened, when the quarantines happened. It was clear. The end line is more fuzzy. And so there's this fuzziness in people's heads at this point as to the end. That's going to have an effect on behaviors and attitudes as well. And that's something we definitely here at Ipsos will be tracking. And we don't have a clear answer to that. Some of this these residual effects can be short term, but some might be very long term. And so I'll give you an example. I was walking in DC on Wednesday. It was on Thursday. It was a really nice day. I was going to teach a class. I teach a class in DC. The bars and restaurants were full, which is great. So there's glimmers of hope. We talked about the increased optimism, but trust but verify. Americans are optimistic, but they're cautious. But to what extent will you always have people wearing masks from this point on? Or for instance, on Wednesday, my daughter had a birthday party, and a lot of her friends called in virtually because they didn't feel comfortable going in loco and to be at the party. These are just some very simple kind of real life examples, but there will be a residual effect of the pandemic, of the virus on people's behaviors. And that's something that we really need to do a good job here at Ipsos tracking looking forward. The second point, and Chris made this point a number of times, I just want to double down on it. It's really about a tale of two Americas. We have a blue America, we have a red America, and perhaps pandemic at a high level brings people together. Basically, the COVID bill was one of those examples. But for the most part, on most issues, in most time periods, America is divided, and that was the case before the pandemic. It was the case during the pandemic, and will be the case after the pandemic. In our minds, that's one of the greatest challenges to American society today, is the ability to come to consensus on key issues of the day. And the last point is related to that point, but it's a general point. Is big government back in American society? American society has always been libertarian in orientation. It's been much more small government than big government, though there's always been a tension there. But the support for the COVID relief bill, $1.9 trillion, it's a mega bill, unprecedented in American history, is an indicator, but is an indicator of a short-term fix to a truly existential problem, or something longer-term suggestive of long-term attitude and behavioral trends in America, where Americans are becoming more pro-government and less small government. We don't know at this point. That's a question mark, though there is some data suggests that over the last few years, Americans have become more pro-government, more government-centric, more in favor of the government intervening in the economy and other domains of our life. But that, once again, might be a short-term change as a result of a once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-100-year pandemic, which obviously puts into check all of our existence at one level or another. So at that, I'll just kind of round out and say, think about the residual effects of the pandemic on behaviors and attitudes. We will be looking at that. Tale of two Americas, that's our central challenge of our time. And is big government back? Well, at least for now. Thanks.
All right, so questions. Let's see. So first one actually is a little bit of a reference to what you're just saying, Cliff. What cues will prompt people to feel that we are back to normal? Is there data about what people are looking at to try to decide when they can do things?
I think that's a great question. Maybe Chris, you want to chime in a second. I think unless there is a definitive signal or cue from leadership at the federal level, this thing will be a slow roll. It'll be a slow burn. That's what we meant a bit about the mushiness in people's heads. They're clear as to the start. Mm-hmm. They're very unclear about the finish. And unless you have policymakers, politicians, leaders making a definitive case for going back, there'll be fuzziness there. Chris, do you want to maybe chime in a bit?
Yeah, I think that's right. And we have data actually that shows that with our Axios tracker where when we ask about, are you waiting to be vaccinated? Are you waiting for people to say it's okay? There's a lot of differences of opinion, and there isn't any sort of one thing people are waiting for. So I think, what Cliff was talking about of it being sort of more of a slow roll is going to be right. And it's probably going to be the kind of thing that takes multiple sort of signals at something, right? It's not like a single green light, but instead it's probably a series of green lights that people are going to need to see, including the vaccine, including authorities, including seeing other people doing it. So like, seeing people out at the bars will help. That'll take all of that sort of stuff to come together because the data suggests right now there's no one thing that will convince people to get back to normal. How are Americans responding to the new strains of COVID? Is there any behavior change happening there? So they're concerned about it. We have data on that they're very concerned about the new strains of COVID, but they're not really doing anything different. And in fact, I was talking with a public health expert a couple of weeks ago who was saying that's sort of one of the paradoxes, right? Is that like the new strains of COVID are like, okay, this is sort of more dangerous, it's more contagious, but just do what you're already doing, just make sure you're doing it, right? Like keep wearing a mask, keep social distancing, maybe wear 2 masks if you're sort of at risk. So it is sort of one of those sort of paradoxical things of, yeah, be worried about it, but you don't actually do anything different. And that's sort of what our data is telling us. Let's see. You mentioned the rise and fall in trends like trust in the government or consumer confidence is based on partisan identity. Are there any areas where partisans are agreeing on topics? They agree on the stimulus bill to an extent. We do see a majority, small majority, but still a majority of Republicans supporting that. As a little bit of a teaser, we also see that there's a majority of Americans who support raising the minimum wage, not necessarily all the way to $15, but there is a majority that supports increasing it, including a majority of Republicans. So those are 2 areas where there is actually some consensus, even if not perfect, on some topics. Cliff, are there other areas that you can think of where infrastructure? It's always infrastructure week.
But the point there, we made this 4 years ago that if the Trump administration had taken the tact of pushing forward the infrastructure bill rather than the healthcare reform bill, we might have a different administration right now. And so it's infrastructure. There's broad-based support. People see it as an economic benefit. It's a driver of the economy and jobs, and that's another issue that unites Americans. I was just going to say, battle for the soul of America. We asked that question during the election. There's broad-based support that the election was a battle for the soul of America. Probably different souls, different color souls, but definitely Americans in general agreed that the last election was a battle for the soul of America.
Yeah.
So
and I think that sort of speaks to the idea that this sort of age of uncertainty is not behind us. That slide I showed earlier about people wanting to, or rather not expecting the country to be able to come out more united and stronger than ever is also something that sort of people are a little bit more bipartisan on.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say sort of, we're obviously talking about policy, but Americans, independent of their political persuasion, can agree on simple things like family, the importance of family, the importance of local community, the importance of children, and all the sort of, all the things that go with that. And so obviously when it comes to policy and politics is highly charged at this point. But the simple things like that, Americans and humans in general can agree on a whole host of much more basic issues of life. The question is, how do you get people talking about that rather than talking about politics? It's very much like the Thanksgiving table, at least in the young household. We don't talk politics, we don't talk religion, but we talk about each other's kids and how they're doing in sports, and how mom is doing, and how Aunt Rita is doing, and those sorts of things, and people and how things are going in the local community, friends down the street. Those are all things that Americans and humans in general can unify around, not politics and religion. Those are dangerous places to be nowadays in America.
Yeah, very much so. Someone asks if there are patterns inside the Republican Party between Trumpian versus non-Trumpian Republicans. I think the challenge is, how do you define that as Trumpian or non-Trumpian? I mean, if you define that as if they voted for Trump, that's almost all Republicans. We've done a couple of questions with Axios about whether Republicans believe the future of the Republican Party should be with Trump, that he should be their nominee for the 2024 presidency. And there we find a little bit more division, where it's about 55% who say yes and about 35% who say no, and the rest are sort of don't know. So if you sort of look at that as a proxy, you certainly do see some differences, right? And those differences do primarily come out in sort of some of these more cultural issues, but they also come out in a lot of these sort of COVID issues, where the Trump is the future of the Republican Party. Republicans are also the ones who think COVID is not a big deal and that the mask mandates are bad and they don't wear masks and things like that. So they very much sort of take their cues from the former president. Someone else asked if we could show slide 19 again. So here it is. You can see that the number of people who think that they'll get back to normal more than a year from now, which is the light blue, has gone from 30% at the beginning of the year down to 18%, which I think reflects sort of cleanly sort of the declining number of people who think it's going to take a long time to get back to normal. And then increasingly, there's sort of people that think it's going to be something between a month and 6 months from now to get back to normal. You can sort of see that in all the sort of red and orange lines together. Do we think a spike in COVID cases, do we think we will see a spike in COVID cases because of the mask mandates being lifted? We're not epidemiologists, so it's sort of hard for us to speculate on that. Not really our area of expertise. We do, though, have data that suggests that if there is a spike in cases, the majority of Americans would support ratcheting some of these restrictions back up. So again, it sort of goes to sort of the whole wait and see public health perspective of most Americans. If things get worse again, we do see most Americans saying it'd be okay to reimpose mask mandates or reimpose limitations on social gatherings. All right, I think that's all we have for our questions today. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate the time. We will be back for our next one on May 13th. In the meantime, you can find this deck and all of our other research on our website on ipsos.com.
I really want to thank the both of you for today's interesting presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, then we will do so by email. You will also receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation. And of course, we welcome the opportunity to speak with you, so please feel free to reach out to us. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.